Well, the parable of the prodigal son is probably the most well-known and famous of all the parables that Jesus taught. The word prodigal, though, is not a common word used in our vocabulary today, but it's used to describe a person who's wasteful and reckless with their money or their possessions. But it could also refer to someone who no longer attends Mass or is spiritually lost and confused. The story begins with the youngest son asking his father for his share of his father's estate, not in the future, but immediately. And although this must have hurt his father immensely, his father complied with his troubled son's wishes. Within days, his son was on his way, traveling to a distant country as far away from his family as possible. Now, away from the rules and responsibilities of his family, he could really live. And live it up, he did. But when the money ran out, so did his friends. And to make matters worse, there was a great famine that swept over the land, and he was forced to seek work from a local businessman who sent him to his fields to feed his pigs. Remember that the Jewish people were forbidden to eat or even touch pigs. To do so would be a terrible sin. But with the raging famine going on and no money, taking care of pigs was the best that he could find. Back home, he always had enough food. Back home, he had sandals and wore fine clothes. Back home, he had a family who loved him. But here his life had become a living hell. But you don't have to travel far from home to leave home. Some of us leave home without stepping out of the door. Some of us eventually return home. Others never do. Back in the 1990s, I was a youth minister on the west side of Madison. Living a few houses away from me was a family who had a troubled teenage daughter. A parent's worst nightmare is when a child gets involved with friends who are bad for them, friends who do drugs or abuse alcohol, friends who border on criminal activity and are a danger not only to society, but to your child as well. And the more you push back, the more drawn they are to their so-called friends. You can see it so clearly what is happening to them, but they seem oblivious. Such was the case with my neighbor's teenage daughter. She dropped out of school activities she used to enjoy, and the good role models in her life she totally abandoned. She was in a crash course to disaster, and those who loved her were worried sick. But for some reason, known only to God, she wanted to be confirmed. She also stayed connected to our youth group, which gave her unconditional love and no judgment. And that's how I got to know her, as she was an active member of our youth group, coming to all the events we held. But what was going on in her head remained a mystery. Although she didn't leave home, she mentally did, abandoning everyone who loved her. She was miserable, and like the prodigal son in the gospel reading, her life also became a hell on earth. The prodigal son lost everything he had. He was so hungry that the food he was feeding the pigs looked good. Sitting among the pigs that were better fed than he was, he reflected on what his life had become. And then he finally came to his senses. As hard as it would be, he decided to go home to face his father, who he believed would never forgive him. How could he wondered, after what he had done? So he said to himself, I will say to my father, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore, so treat me as one of your hired workers. But while he was still a ways off, his father, who apparently would look out each day in hopes of seeing his wayward son return, spotted him walking towards home. He immediately jumped up and ran to his son, embracing and kissing him. He interrupted his son's speech about no longer deserving to be called his son and told his servants to bring his son the finest robe they could find and put it on him. Get a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fattened calf we have been saving for a great party. And by the way, pick up some kosher barbecue sauce. And let's party like we have never partied before. For my son was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. Our hearts, though, break for the older son, who was deeply hurt by his father's love and forgiveness for his younger brothers, who, as he said, spent all of his father's money on wild living and prostitutes. But his father answered him, "My son, you are here with me always, and everything I have is yours. But now we must celebrate and rejoice, because your brother was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." On a bright and sunny day, my neighbor's daughter got confirmed. I was at the celebration at her house, and it's something I will never forget. The family and extended family were all there. We all sat in a circle in their living room, and one by one, gifts were given to her. She unwrapped each gift, looked at it, and said nothing. Nothing. A leather-bound Bible with her name engraved on it from her grandpa. A beautiful rosary handed down from generation to generation from her grandmother. A gold necklace with matching earrings from her parents. Clothes from aunts and uncles, present after present. And she said not one word. I marveled at the dramatic scene that played out before me, and I wondered what was going on in her head. But somewhere, deep in her heart, she came to her senses. Maybe it was the sacred chrism oil put on her forehead during confirmation. Maybe it was the love showered upon her from everyone present. Maybe it was the grace of God that somehow melted away whatever was tormenting her. But whatever it was, the prodigal daughter came home. Without saying a word, she stood up, walked to her grandpa, threw her arms around him, and saying nothing, she held him as tight as she could for the longest time. Then she went to her grandma and did the same thing. Her mom, her dad, each aunt and uncle, everyone who was there, she threw her arms around them and held them tightly. She said nothing, but she didn't need to. The prodigal daughter was finally home. And so we had one great party because the prodigal daughter was dead and had come to life again. She was lost and had been found. My brothers and sisters, are you perhaps a prodigal son or daughter? If so, maybe it's time to come home. And if someone in your life has become like the prodigal son, maybe it's time to let them come home. Or maybe, just maybe, it's time to go out and bring them home.